Good afternoon once again. Brethren, in many ways it seems like that right around feast time, just shortly prior to the feast, we have certainly turned a corner, or in the process of turning a corner in world affairs. And I hope that we are taking note of some of that. The situation in the Middle East, of course, that has taken a dramatic turn right prior to the feast, just the evening prior to the Feast of Trumpets. Now, if you know, it's sort of hard to get any news these days other than what's happening in Tallahassee. But there was another bit of election news that came up in the early part of this week, and that was that the Israeli Parliament met. And Prime Minister Barak recognized that he was defeated before he started. The opposition already had the majority of legislators lined up. They were prepared to make a vote of no confidence and to dissolve the Israeli government. And so, recognizing that he was defeated, Prime Minister Barak forged a bit of a compromise, and that was he would voluntarily step down and call for early elections, and he would negotiate the election, the timing of the election with the opposition. They would agree on a time. So it appears they're going to have an election in Israel this spring. And we'll have to see how many recounts they have when they have their election. They may want some, maybe some observers or somebody from Florida that could come over and sort of help them to be able to run an efficient, effective election. Maybe they'll get somebody from Palm Beach County to design their ballot for them or something. I don't know. Well, they're going to have elections, and every indication is that Barak is going to be defeated. That seems to be what is clearly on the horizon right now. He was elected by a very large majority when he went into office, but right now it appears that anybody that they run against him, they've matched up in opinion polls, and anybody he runs against beats him hands down. He is not a popular fellow in Israel right now, with the mess that things have been in fact, it's interesting, even Ariel Sharon, who is the guy that went to the Temple Mount, even he defeats him hands down if they're matched up in a situation, in an election there. So it is one thing that a lot of people have not realized, there are Palestinian Arabs, but there are also Arabs that have Israeli citizenship. And they make up about 10% of the voting population in Israel. And the divide between the Jews has been such that it is the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens that have actually been the ones who have provided the majority for the labor government. And that now they have openly come out and sided with Arafat, and so it's created quite a stir and quite a backlash over there. So the situation is heating up there. We have what I think clearly is going to be an increasing vacuum on the world scene that will be created by the inability of the United States to act decisively. Let's face it, regardless of who's sworn in 20th of January, we're going to have a very divided government. A government that is just almost divided right down the middle in terms of Congress particularly. So there is I think an increasing vacuum. Right now it's already being created because President Clinton only has a short time left in office, and as far as the international community, there's a lot of damage he can do left over here, executive orders he can issue and things like that, but in terms of being taken seriously on the international level, the international community looks at him as someone who is not going to be in a position to carry through with any agreement he makes. They don't want to they're not interested in reaching an agreement with Clinton because they say, well, he's going to be out of office, and what's he going to be able to do to implement anything? And he's not in a position to really do any particular thing. He's tried his Middle Eastern diplomacy, and that hasn't worked. So a vacuum is being created. If you've noticed, Europe is already taking definite steps to step into that vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and it always gets filled. In fact, it's sort of interesting. Russia and France have been collaborating on jumping into the middle and trying to be in the middle on this Middle Eastern peace negotiations. They have sort of chafed at the United States being the one who was really calling the shots over there. So this is sort of their opportunity. They're putting together a defense force in Europe that is going to be operating outside the confines of NATO. And as the Europeans have been talking about it, Russia, President Putin commented last week, well, he'd like to help out on that. You know, they could cooperate with that. They could sort of work in with Western Europe on that. So, you know, a situation is certainly going on the world scene that I think, as you look at what's happening, we are definitely turning a corner in terms of going to the next phase. For the last several years, we have had a relative lull. The economy has been going well in the United States. We have, on the international scene, we've been sort of front and center, the world's only superpower, as we have liked to sort of bask in that limelight. The situation is changing. We're turning a corner. We're getting ready to move into a new phase. And, of course, what that new phase will set the stage for is all of the events that are prophesied in the pages of Scripture. There are a lot of things that you and I may see over the next 5 to 10 years that are going to be absolutely amazing in terms of what we have seen and what people have expected. Things are in the process of changing. Now, what is it that is going to enable us to make it through those times successfully? You know, none of us come into life where you sort of are handed a ready-made script when you're born. And you know all the details and everything you're going to encounter, and you know all the, the endings that line up for all of the problems or difficulties you may face. No, you are faced with going through your life, and whether it's the problems of day by day or whether it's things that are happening on a grand scale, you're faced with going through those things one day at a time, dealing with them in ways and in circumstances where you don't know exactly what tomorrow is going to bring. There are a lot of twists and turns that all of us have had in our lives. I guess just about any of us. If you go back 10 years ago, if somebody had told you what was going to transpire in your life 10 years ago, you know, what was going to happen over the course of the next 10 years, you wouldn't have believed it. I wouldn't have believed it. A lot of things have happened. We find ourselves in circumstances, sometimes on a personal level, and certainly we're going to be plunged into a time of increasing pressure on the world scene. And the world around us and the shape and the configuration of what is happening in this world is going to begin to undergo some very dramatic changes. Now, Paul tells us in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, wherefore, seeing that we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Paul says we're encompassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, who is that great cloud of witnesses? Well, he's just gone through Hebrews 11, which we commonly call the faith chapter. And in Hebrews 11, he has recounted circumstances of a host of men and women of faith. And then he ends up here in chapter 12, and he says, now we're surrounded with so great a cloud of witnesses, and seeing that we have this, let's lay aside the weight, let's run with patience the race set before us. You see, the race of life is not pictured as a 100-yard dash or a 50-yard dash. It's a marathon. But there's one difference. At least even when you're running the marathon, you know where the finish line is. When you're running the race of life, You don't know where the finish line is. Is it 50 years or 75 years or 80 years or 90 years? You don't know. Maybe it's 30 years. Nobody knows. You don't come knowing what the finish line is. You just know that you have to run. He says, run with patience the race that is set before us. And that's, of course, something that most of us don't like to do, is exercise patience. We're sort of like the fellow said, Lord, give me patience, but give it to me right now, because we don't like waiting. I don't know that human beings have ever just enjoyed waiting, but, in times past, people expected to wait a little more. Today, people, you get something out of the freezer or out of the refrigerator, stick it in the microwave, nuke it for a couple of minutes, and, you're ready to go. What if you had to go out and take some wood and, get the fire going and let, cut up all the ingredients and put them in the pot and put them on the, on the fire to boil? Well, you could be spending half a day just trying to get something ready. And no 5-minute deals. You couldn't run down to the fast food place and complain, if by the time you had driven around the corner and had gotten to the window, they didn't have the stuff there ready to hand to you. I mean, I thought this was fast food. You're talking 2-3 minutes. I got to sit here and wait. That's not fast food. Patience is not something that's really inculcated at the beginning of the 21st century. We want instant access. Time was you wrote a letter and you spent days getting across the country. Now, you can write a letter and it can still spend days. It can spend days getting from Kilgore to Big Sandy. But most times today, increasingly, when people write letters, they don't give them to the post office. They press a button and it goes by email. And just, you can be getting something just a very short time after someone in Australia or South Africa sent you something. Just incredible. You can watch in real time events that are going on, whether it's in Tallahassee or whether it's in China. You can watch it and see it. We live in a world of instant access and a time where there's not a whole lot of patience, and yet we're told that we have a race to run with patience. Look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And he says in verse 5, you've forgotten the exhortation which speaks unto you as unto children. My son, don't despise the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you're rebuked of him. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens. He scourges every son whom he receives. God is not a permissive parent. He is not one that just sort of, lets his kids grow up any which way. God chastens whom he loves. Because God loves us, he is prepared to work in our lives to guide us. Now, if you endure chastening, God's dealing with you as with sons. What son is he whom the Father chastens not? So if you're not chastened, then in reality, you're not counted as legitimate sons. So he said, we have fathers, human fathers, verse 9, that corrected us, and we gave them reverence and respect. Shall we not much more be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? Truly, they, for a few days, chastened us after their own pleasure. In other words, for a short time that we were young and at home, we had human fathers, and they disciplined us, but they did it based on what seemed like a good idea to them and what they thought was appropriate. They did it after the way that represented their idea. But the contrast is that God always for our profit. Now, hopefully by and large, the discipline that we received at home was for our profit, but no human parent is a perfect parent. But God is. He for our profit, that we might be partakers of His holiness. There is an object and a purpose that God has in mind when He works with us and disciplines us. He wants us to share in His very character and His very nature. He wants us to partake, to share in His holiness. So whatever God is doing in your life and in mine is for our profit. It's for our benefit that we might be able to share ultimately in His perfect character, His very nature. Now, no chastening for the present seems to be joyous. When you were a child, did you enjoy getting spanked? Did you enjoy... No chastening for the present seems to be joyous. I remember, I have one particular memory that you talk about putting a test or a trial on a kid. I can remember being given a knife, sent out to cut a switch. Now, I knew who the switch was going to be used on. It was going to be used on me. Now, you're really in a dilemma. You've got to cut one big enough that it'll pass muster. See, I mean, you can't come in hauling some little thing like that. Then they may go out and get it, and it'd really be one. So it's got to be big enough to pass muster, but you want to make it as small as you think you can get by with. See, I mean, you don't want something that's you want something that's going to do as little damage as possible. So you're really in a dilemma, figuring how small can I go and still be big enough. Well, no chastening for the present seems to be joyous. You're not really all excited and just, oh, this is wonderful. I'm going to have a trial. I'm going to be chastened. I'm going to be disciplined. No chastening for the present seems to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward, when God is the one doing the chastening, nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. You know, when you go through it and you emerge on the other side, that's why Paul says, lift up the hands that hang down and the feeble knees. You know, you look like you're just sort of barely making it. He says, come on, stand up straight. You're going to emerge on the other side. And when you do, realize that what you're going through yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. That once you emerge, you know what? When we're going through trials and difficulties, and we've all gone through peaks and valleys in our life, there have been times when, you know, you've stood on the mountaintop, as it were, and there have been times when you've been down in the valley and it seemed like the shadows were closing in. Yet, he says, while none of the problems, none of the difficulties are enjoyable when you're going through them, afterward it yields something. It produces something that is beneficial. Now, Paul talked about, he set the stage for these things in Hebrews 12 by the chapter that we know as the faith chapter, Hebrews 11. I want to focus our attention a little bit on that because, you know, the key to successfully going through the things that the years ahead hold as the events on the world scene turn a corner and the events in our own personal lives and the ups and downs that we may go through just in the normal course of things. Ultimately, the only key, or the key to successfully going through those times is to walk by faith. Now, Hebrews 11 tells us in verse 1 that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is substantial. It provides evidence. By it, the elders obtained a good report. You know, there are times in life when you're confronted with what you see on the one hand and what God says on the other, and the two are contradictory. When you read in Revelation, you read about a time when a great governmental power is going to exercise authority on the world scene. And it's going to exercise a very strong and stern authority. It's going to insist that everyone give undivided loyalty and allegiance and devotion to that system. It's going to enforce a virtual brand on people with the threat that you're not going to be able to participate in the economic system. You're not going to be able to buy or sell if you don't conform and step in line and follow what they're saying. Now, you know, we all like to eat. And when you're told your alternative is you're not going to be able to work, you're not going to be able to provide, you're not going to be able to buy or sell, you're not going to be able to survive if you don't do what we're telling you to do. Tremendous pressure and threat that is going to be exercised. Now, if you base your decisions on what you see, here's a system that looks like it's totally in control. It is in charge. It is exercising great authority. It is absolutely squashing any sort of opposition. Based on everything you can see and discern from a human standpoint, it's here. And it's in charge. Yet, on the other hand, you read in the Scripture and God says, this system is going to pass away. The God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. I'm going to pour out plagues on those who give their devotion and allegiance to that system. I'm going to crush that system. I'm going to take those two pompous individuals that are strutting around up there and demanding that everybody give adulation to them. I'm going to pick them up and throw them in a lake of fire. They're going to snap, crackle, pop, and be gone. Well, you can read that in Revelation. That's what it says. But everything you see and everything you're surrounded with tells you something else. You've got God's Word for how it's going to end up. You've got what your eyes tell you for what's happening. Now, what do you believe? Faith is the evidence of things not seen. You see, if you're walking by faith, then you believe what God says, even though everything you see physically contradicts those promises. See, it's by faith that the elders obtained a good report. The individuals of old who are mentioned here in Hebrews 11 were well reported of. They received that good report because of faith. Now, through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. The things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. God called it into being. There was a time when nothing existed. A time when there was no matter. A time when there was nothing from a physical standpoint. Scientists talk about the Big Bang. Well, where did you get something to go bang? The hydrogen atom. Well, where did you get the hydrogen atom? In other words, where did you start? You had to start with something. You heard about the scientists that told God, He says, we scientists, we've been studying all this stuff, DNA and everything. We can make a man. We can do, we can do everything. We can make a man. And God said, no, you can't. Scientists said, sure can. God says, okay, go ahead, let's see. So the first thing the scientist did was he started scooping up this dirt, and God said, no, wait a minute. Make your own dirt. If you're going to make it, start from scratch. Start from what does not exist. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. God spoke it, and it was. There was a time when there was nothing. And then something came into existence. You understand that by faith. Now, the first man of faith that we read of in the Bible is Abel. By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaks. Now you learn something very crucial about faith at this point, because the very first person of faith that you run into in the Bible met an untimely end. Faith does not guarantee that you're going to live to be 997 or whatever it is. We don't know exactly how old Abel lived, but he didn't live very long. He didn't even live long enough that he had reproduced and had children. No indication that he was even married, and if he was, he didn't have children, because it mentions that later on Adam and Eve had another son by the name of Seth, who was sort of a replacement for Abel, and the righteous line came from Seth. Abel had a very brief life, certainly extremely brief by comparison to all of his relatives who lived for centuries. Abel was cut off as a very young man. The indication is just, coming into adulthood, and he was taking a stand in terms of worshiping God. He offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. He obtained witness that he was righteous. God bore witness, and that witness is recorded. God testifies of what Abel did. And in that sense, though Abel is dead, he speaks down through the centuries, his life and his example. But the very first thing you learn about faith is that if you walk by faith, that does not mean that nothing bad will ever happen to you. The first man of faith that we ever read of in Scripture died an untimely death. Cain blamed his brother for Cain's own problems. You see, Cain offered a sacrifice that was unacceptable to God. Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. You know, human nature hasn't changed. You know, you come on down to the classroom today, and the teacher gives a test. One kid makes 100, and everybody else flunks the test. Who do the kids that flunk the test get mad at? Do they get mad at themselves because they hadn't studied and prepared? Yeah. They get mad at the kid who made 100. They're mad at you made us look bad. Yeah, if you hadn't done so good, well, maybe the teacher would have, she'd have curved the grades. You got us in trouble. We're going to fix you. You made us look bad. Well, wait a minute. How did you make us look bad? Well, you did good and I did bad, and if you hadn't done so good, maybe my bad wouldn't have looked so bad. That's human nature. People get mad at the fella who did better because somehow by comparison they don't look quite so good. If he'd have done worse than they did, then, that would have been different. Cain, instead of taking responsibility and recognizing that he didn't do what he was instructed to do, Cain blamed Abel. Said, yeah, got me in trouble with God, didn't you? I guess you're satisfied. Yeah, you think you're pretty smart. You went out and did it that way, and you got me in trouble. That was the way Cain looked at it. He got so worked up and so mad and angry about it that at one point they got off isolated, and Cain killed his brother. Just murdered him. Abel trusted God. Now, Enoch also trusted God, and by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had translated him. Now, he was translated or transferred. Evidently, somebody was looking for him because he wasn't found. They were evidently looking for him to do some damage to him. And God removed him. God transferred him. Now, before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Now, Abel also pleased God. God allowed Abel to be martyred, and he removed Enoch so that he was not found by those who were searching for him. The point is that both of these men walked by faith. They both trusted God, and God worked in their lives according to His purpose for them. The one thing that it all has in common, verse 6, is that without faith it's impossible to please God. He that comes to God must believe that He is, that He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. Now, what do you mean? Why is it impossible to please God without faith? What kind of relationship can you have with someone if you don't trust them? Without trust, there is no basis of a healthy relationship. If you don't trust somebody, how far are you going to follow them? You are going to follow some character. Maybe you're lost and you can't find your way. You're in some city and some real seedy-looking character comes up and says, "Here, why don't you follow me? I'll show you. I'll show you a shortcut." How far are you going to follow him? Probably not very far, because if you don't trust somebody, you're not going to follow them. Now, God is developing a relationship with us. He's our Father, we're His children. We will never follow God if we don't trust Him. You see, without faith, it's impossible to please Him because you're not going to follow God and stick with Him if you don't trust Him and believe Him. You can be very careful and meticulous in your observance of the law, but that's not the same as trusting God. Now, if you trust God and you believe God, you will be keeping the law. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees were very careful and very meticulous in their keeping of the law. If you had asked a Pharisee or a Sadducee, do you think that the law is done away? Oh my, would they have been incensed. What a crazy idea. Oh no, we really revere Moses. You read some of the things they told Jesus. In the book of John, the first time you read about the Pharisees and Sadducees sitting down and having a meeting together, making common cause, you know what prompted it? It was right in the aftermath of the resurrection of Lazarus. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, who normally did not like each other, hated one another, got together and held a council as to how they could get rid of Jesus Christ. Now, this is a group of religious folks who prided themselves on keeping the law. Very meticulous in their tithing and in their Sabbath observance and all these things. And what were they planning? They were planning murder. Well, that's covered in the law too, isn't it? Thou shalt not kill. Here were men who were plotting murder. And it even got to the point where they hired false witnesses, all of which was totally contrary to the law. They knew that. Why did they do it? They were religious folks. They gave adherence or proclaimed adherence to the law. Well, when you read the account there in the Gospel of John, what you find is after the resurrection of Lazarus, they got together and they were sort of panic was beginning to build. And they said, if we let this fellow alone, everybody's going to believe on him. People are already talking about this must be the Messiah. Everyone is going to be acknowledging him as the Messiah. They're all going to believe on him. And you know what that means? The Romans are going to hear about it. Now, when the Romans hear about all this big stir about the Jews having a Messiah and the Jews having a king, why did they have contempt? They were praising their gods of stone and all their idols because they thought they had really been delivered. They were so great. And then the seventh day, they walked around and they walked around and they walked around. They walked around 7 days, blew the trumpet, the people shouted. And what happened to the great walls of Jericho? They came tumbling down. All of a sudden, there wasn't any wall. Oops, here they come. Where's the wall? Where's our defense? Where's our security? Everything they placed their trust and confidence in collapsed and failed then. Just, boom, there it went, tumbling down. You see, the only source of security, Rahab understood there's only one source of security. It's not some big wall, it's not some great fortification. You trust God. You trust God and you're secure. Now, Paul went on in verse 32. He says, what shall I say more? Time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. And time would fail me to tell about all of them too. But I'll tell you a little bit. One of the points I would like to make as you look at these men that he names, Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, people aren't just born with faith. Little babies don't just come out and all of a sudden, boy, you can look at that one and tell he's just born with faith. Just exudes faith. What you find is the great men and women of faith, they had their weak times too. They came to develop that faith and that trust in God. When you first meet Gideon, there in the book of Judges, you first meet Gideon. Gideon is hiding. He's behind his father's wine press. And he is winnowing grain behind his father's wine press. Now, if you know anything, you've read about winnowing in ancient times. Today on these big combines, the wheat, when it's separated, goes through a process to separate it from the, there in the head. The chaff is the straw and the things that connect there. And what you want is the clean grain.
and you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. Well, they run it through a process, and they have a big fan that blows because the chaff is very light, and it'll blow away. The grain is heavier, and it'll fall down. So they have that built in some of these big combines. In ancient times, they went through a process initially to thresh, where they put it through something, whether it was using a wooden mallet or having animals walk on it, or to the pressure, the weight, the cutting edge that begins to separate all this out. But then you still got a big pile of it. So after it was threshed, they would take it by the shovelful. They would do this out on the threshing floor, which was normally a hilltop, sort of a flat place. And the time of year that they did it, there was a lot of wind, and so they would, once they had threshed it, then they would take it by the shovelful. They'd throw it up, and it was windy, and so the wind would blow the chaff, and the wheat, the grain would fall back down. They would go through this. Sometimes they'd have somebody out with a winnowing fan to help generate a little bit of air to do this. Now, you needed a big open platform to accomplish anything. When you meet Gideon, he's hiding behind his father's winepress. How is he winnowing grain? Throwing up a little handful. You know, he's going to spend all day just working for dinner. But he's hiding there because he's scared. The Midianites have been coming through, marauding the place, burning fields, stealing things, tearing everything up. And so poor old Gideon, he's hiding out here. He's trying to get him a little something for supper. All of a sudden, an angel appears. It says, "Greetings, you mighty man of valor." Well, Gideon, he starts looking around and see who's standing there. Angel said, "Look, you're going to deliver Israel from the Midianites." And Gideon says, "Who, me? Surely not me." The angel says, "Yes." And he says, "Now I'll tell you, first job you got, I notice there's a big idol of Baal here in town. Now, God's not going to deliver Israel while they're worshiping Baal. So the first thing you do is you go and destroy the idol. Go and destroy the idol." Oh. Folks like that idol. It's sort of popular around here, just about everybody. I don't worship it, but most everybody around here does. The angel says, "Well, that's where you start. I want you to destroy that thing, and then you're going to go." Well, Gideon thought about it, and he wanted to do what God said, but he didn't want anybody to know. So he waited until sort of the wee hours of the morning when it was real dark, and he got out there and he destroyed it. He got rid of it, cut it down, got rid of it. He didn't think anybody would ever figure out who it was. Well, back then, just sort of like now, word gets out. Word gets around. Wasn't long before people put two and two together, and they said, "I bet that Gideon got rid of our idol." Well, you remember the story. Gideon had to develop faith. He had to learn. He had to build a relationship with God. And God used Gideon. In fact, he had Gideon get an army together, and Gideon had the army together, and he thought he was finally pumped up, and he was ready to go down and get the Midianites. And God said, "Gideon, we got a problem with this army." And maybe Gideon thought, "Oh, you're going to add a few more men." God said, "No, the army's too big. I let you go down there with an army like that. Next thing I know, you're going to be feeling pretty proud of yourself and thinking you must be a pretty good general. I want you to call your whole army together and tell everybody that's scared to go home." Now, Gideon did not have the same experience that Colonel Travis had at the Alamo. Colonel Travis drew a line in the sand, and he said everybody's scared to go home. Well, virtually everybody, I think maybe with one exception, everybody crossed the line and stood with Colonel Travis. Gideon drew the line in the sand, and 2/3 of the people disappeared. Boom. Now, you think maybe his heart began to sink as he saw all these folks. Our whole army's melting away. 2/3 of them gone. And God looked at him and he said, "Gideon, this will never do. Your army is too big. Take them all down to the river and tell them to get a drink of water. Let's watch." And so they did. God finally said, "You see, Gideon, you see those? If you look out there in that group, I noticed there are about 300 of them that are down lapping water like a dog. Those are yours. Tell everybody else to go home." Now, God took Gideon and those 300 and He conquered the Midianites. Gideon grew to become a man of great faith. But you know, Gideon didn't just start out that way. Gideon started out scared. Gideon had to come to know God. Now, you go through and you look at the rest of them. Barak. Barak was a judge in Israel. Israel was being pummeled by the Canaanites. And they were so intimidated. There was a woman who was a prophetess. Her name was Deborah. God gave her special revelations, and she would reveal things to people in terms of what God said. And God sent a message to Deborah, revealed a message to Deborah, and He said, I want you to go and tell Barak, who's the judge in Israel. You go tell Barak to get his army together and go smite the Canaanites. Deborah went and told Barak, and Barak said, no, wait a minute. You want me to get an army and go get those guys? I'm not sure I want to do that. I'm not going to go out. I'm not going to go unless you go with me. Deborah says, I had to become like a mother in Israel. They were like a bunch of little kids. She had to take them by the hand. Mama had to take them by the hand, take them out to battle. Well, Barak was not someone that started out in a real dramatic way as a great man of faith. And Samson, well, you remember the story of Samson. Samson was sort of a self-centered fellow who was focused on himself. Samson didn't really come to himself. You know, Samson is a remarkable person. He never saw until after he became blind. Now, Samson liked riddles. And there's a riddle for you. Who's the only man that never saw until he became blind? Well, Samson. You see, it was only after Samson had his eyes put out and he was tied up to a post, walking around and around, turning a millstone like an ox or a donkey. And he was spending his whole day walking around and around, grinding grain. Samson had a lot of time to think. A lot of time to think about things. Think about a wasted life. Think about all the opportunities and all the things that God had given him and how he had thrown it away. Samson, in those last weeks and months of his life, developed a relationship with God and came to have the faith and the confidence in God that God used him to accomplish more in his death than he ever had in the entirety of his life. Jephthah. Now, you know, if there's anybody that's entitled to hold a grudge, sort of hold on to a resentment, Jephthah was in a position to do that. Go back and read the story of Jephthah. Jephthah was an illegitimate child. His father had been married and had a number of children by his wife, but Jephthah was not the son of his father's wife. Jephthah's mother was a harlot. His mother was a harlot, and his father had a relationship with her, and Jephthah was born. Jephthah, he evidently acknowledged Jephthah, and Jephthah grew up there at home. But you know what happened as soon as his father died? Jephthah's brothers said, look, buddy, you get out of here. We tolerated you and we put up with you as long as Dad was alive because he liked to have you around. We don't want any part of you. If you think you're going to get one dime that comes from our father's inheritance, you're crazy. We're not going to give you anything. We don't acknowledge you as our brother. We don't acknowledge you as our father's son. You get out of here. We don't want you around. Jephthah left, wound up living in a remote wilderness area, collected a bunch of people around that were sort of like him, sort of the outcasts of society. Time went on, things got rougher and rougher, and the Ammonites were marauding the land. Jephthah was sort of the Robin Hood of the day. And one day, the elders of Gilead, this was the half tribe of Manasseh that lived on the east side of the Jordan. That's where Jephthah came from. They sort of showed up at Jephthah's cave, hat in hand, and they said, you know, we're really in a bind. These Ammonites are coming in, they're tearing up everything, we're scared to death. We'd like to offer you the job of being our judge, our ruler. We'd like for you to please deliver us. Now, you know, Jephthah could have said, deliver you guys. Why would I want to deliver you? I want to help the Ammonites. You know, if anybody was looking for a reason to hold on to a grudge and a resentment, Jephthah could have. Jephthah went on to judge Israel for 6 years. God used him. David, Samuel, the prophets,
Through faith they subdued kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the violence of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness they were made strong. They waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. You know, you go through, and as you get on down to about the middle of verse 35, it seems like if you've got enough faith, then everything... Through faith, why, they quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, they turned to flight armies, the dead were raised. That's great. But you know, there were others that had just as much faith that were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. They would not renounce or recount. They would not renounce the truth. There were others that had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, bonds and imprisonment, stones, sawn asunder, tempted, slain with the sword, wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. Individuals who trusted God and believed God, though everything and every evidence they saw to the contrary contradicted it, but faith was the evidence of things not seen, and they believed God. And they went through whatever they had to go through because they trusted God. They trusted God, and because they trusted Him, they followed Him. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us would not be made perfect. They're going to receive the promise, but they're not going to receive it before we do. No, they're resting in their graves. Because when the seventh trumpet blows and they rise from the grave, that's the time when you and I will be changed and transformed. We'll all enter the kingdom together. They lived and died. They trusted God. They died in faith. They've not received the promise, but they will. They'll receive it when you and I receive it. But you see, in order for us to receive it, we've got to do the same thing they did. That is, we have to trust God. Now, when you trust God and you follow God, you don't always know every specific thing you may have to go through. You look at these men and women and you find that different ones went through different things. Some, as we would look at it, had it a little easier, and some had it a little harder. But you see, they trusted God, and God brought them through. You never have to be afraid if you're walking with God, because you're not alone. You never have to go through anything alone as long as you're walking with God. David said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you're with me." What do I have to be scared of? I'm walking with God. You know, brethren, the essence of faith, of really trusting God, the essence of faith gets back to truly knowing God. Jesus Christ had perfect faith. Completely, totally, perfectly trusted the Father. Jesus Christ perfectly knew the Father. He came to reveal the Father. When you and I have trouble trusting, what it really says is we don't know the Father well enough. Faith is something that naturally follows from truly knowing God, because to know Him is to trust Him. The better you know God, the more confidence you have in His love, and the more trust you have in Him. To know Him is to trust Him. You and I don't know every specific thing that we're going to have to go through personally. We know, let's say, an overview of some things that the world is going to go through. But regardless of what you and I have to go through, of what we may see, the key comes back to the same thing that you read outlined right here in Hebrews 11 and 12. We're encompassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. As we look at all these examples, let's stand up straight and go forward, trusting God. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. But if you know that God is and that He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him, you come to truly know God, then you have the basis to trust God and to walk with God every day by day, step by step.